Most people treat Copilot as a helpful feature layer. It is not. It's a distributed decision engine sitting on top of Microsoft Graph that amplifies whatever you encode, intent or ambiguity. Get this wrong and you don't get a harmless draft. You get discoverable leakage, confidently wrong actions, and incident tickets that arrive before the logs. Legal, security, and IT will firefight silent failures at scale. In this masterclass, I'll give you one control pattern, 10 enforceable mandates, and a red flag test you can run tomorrow. This isn't a tour of features. It's a control system masterclass for the people accountable when Copilot goes wrong. Pause here. You are at the starting line. Next, we name the single misunderstanding that creates every downstream failure, and then we map exactly how those failures show up. The foundational misunderstanding. Copilot is not a colleague. Let's set the stake in the ground. Copilot is not a colleague, an assistant, or a junior analyst. Architecturally, it is a control plane component writing Microsoft Graph, compiling decisions in real time. It does not simply generate drafts. It routes, grounds, and executes across your estate according to whatever boundaries and refusal states you actually enforce. That distinction matters because a colleague will ask for clarification. Copilot will evaluate the state you designed and act inside it. If your intent is not encoded, ambiguity becomes policy. This is the only theory you need. Everything else is enforcement. The foundational mistake is framing Copilot as a conversational helper. That framing invites casual prompting, unbounded context, and implicit trust in memory. In reality, you're operating a distributed decision engine. Each request becomes a program. Retrieve data through graph scopes, apply instructions, call tools, and optionally write back. The engine compiles your configuration into behavior. It doesn't care about your intent slides. It cares about scopes, connectors, labels, and gates. Now, let's bring in determinism versus probability. Probabilistic language models are fine for drafting, brainstorming, and synthesis. You can tolerate variation when the output is a paragraph. You cannot tolerate variation when the paragraph is a database write. Execution requires determinism, clear boundaries, structured outputs, and a refusal model that prefers silence over fiction. Every place you allow unconstrained free text without structure, you convert a deterministic execution path into a probabilistic one. And that's where conditional chaos starts. Before we continue, you need to understand the environment you already run. Teams Conversations feed graph, Outlook bodies feed graph, SharePoint and OneDrive inventories feed graph. Power Automate turns prompts into actions. The system did exactly what you allowed. It inherited your permissions model and your oversharing. If your tenant has everyone except external libraries with HR files, Copilot doesn't break in. It walks through the front door you left open. Intent versus configuration is the gap that creates incidents. Leaders say, only summarize project conversations. Bypass, the configuration says user has access, so content is in scope. Leaders assume summarize this channel means just this channel. The authorization engine hears everything the caller can read. You think you drew a boundary. You didn't. You described one. Let me make the psychological trap explicit. Because Copilot speaks confidently, people assume authority. That voice invites obedience under time pressure. When Copilot cites a non-existent policy, it's not a quality problem. It's a control problem. No authoritative source gating, no refusal state, no citations. Therefore, confident fiction becomes operational truth. That's why this is the most dangerous failure psychologically, not technically. People follow text that sounds right. This is also where memory illusions creep in. Users project human continuity onto a stateless front paired with stateful caches. They expect, remember when I said, to work across sessions and channels. It does not unless you design explicit state contracts with visible context ledgers and reset semantics. Otherwise, prompts drift, embeddings linger, and outcomes vary. Trust decays. Outputs diverge. Users compensate by overprompting, which widens the blast radius. The thing most people miss, graph scoping and sensitivity labels are not suggestions. They are the only hard edges you have. A label with no enforced policy is a sticker. A scope with no allow list is an invitation. Default deny is not a slogan. It's the difference between bounded retrieval and lateral discovery. You don't fix oversharing with prompt instructions. You fix oversharing with identity, labels, and access reviews. Then you let Copilot inherit the safer world. This clicked for me when I started thinking of Copilot as an authorization compiler. Every accept clause, every broad connector, every wildcard scope adds branches. Those branches become untested code paths that users will inevitably execute the moment they're rushed. Over time, policies drift away from intent. Exceptions accumulate. These pathways don't disappear. They accumulate. Here's the shortcut nobody teaches. Separate reasoning from execution by design, even before we get to the formal pattern. Force structure on outputs, tables, JSON, schemas, so downstream actions can be deterministic. Require citations for any claim that could drive a decision. Prefer no answer over hallucinated detail. If you remember nothing else, remember this. Silence beats fiction every time. Real-world impact? Miss the frame and you get 5 anchor failures will map precisely to mandates. You get team summaries that quietly ingest HR and legal content because user has access wasn't treated as a boundary. You get invented procedures executed like policy because no authority gate existed. You get power automate flows that modify records without human consent because planning and execution were fused. You get trust collapses from memory illusions. And you get cost spikes that reveal invisible agents running without telemetry. This is not about model unpredictability, it's about architectural responsibility. Copilot entropy grows by default, determinism only exists by design. You own the boundaries or you don't. You own refusal or you don't. You encode intent or the engine compiles your ambiguity into behavior. From here on, we stop talking theory and enforce it. Anchor failure. 1. Graph overreach. Silent data leakage. Start with a scene you've already lived. Someone asks Copilot in Teams, summarize last week's discussion on the rollout. The summary arrives fast, polished, and on the surface, useful. A few hours later, a manager replies, why is HR remediation language in this? Who authorized that? Nobody did. The engine compiled your estate. It followed scopes, not intentions. User has access became content is in scope. Your summary didn't leak because Copilot broke in. It leaked because your boundary never existed in configuration. This is the uncomfortable truth. Microsoft Graph is not a polite librarian. It is an index and retrieval surface that honors the effective permissions of the caller. If your Teams channel sits alongside a SharePoint library that's broadly shared everyone except external, and that library happens to contain HR or legal documents with weak labeling, the retrieval step will see them. The model does not need to be clever to overreach. It only needs your authorization layer to be generous and your scoping to be unbounded. That's why this failure is silent. There's no denied access event, no firewall log, no obvious tripwire. The content was allowed, therefore retrieval was compliant. The only alarm is the downstream human who recognizes language that never belonged in a project recap. By then, the damage is already discoverable. That summary can be forwarded, filed, or subpoenaed. Passive leakage looks harmless until it's exhibit material. The root cause is architectural, relying on user has access as a boundary. That phrase describes a capability, not a constraint. In a distributed decision engine, capability expands context. Context expands surface. Surface expands risk. When you leave graph scopes unconstrained, no connector allow lists, no retrieval filters tied to sensitivity, no default deny on high-risk sources, you hand the engine a map without borders and tell it to be helpful. It is. Excessively. Sensitivity labels get misunderstood here. A label that isn't enforced in policy is a sticker. If your policy doesn't drive deny, redact, or refusal behavior at retrieval time, the label won't stop inclusion. Inheritance matters as well. If a parent site is broadly readable and a child library contains confidential HR, any weak break in inheritance means the graph index reflects that effective openness. Copilot doesn't reason about your intent to keep HR out of project summaries. It reasons about your tenant's access graph. The thing most people miss, oversharing precedes overreach. Teams, OneDrive, SharePoint, years of share to collaborate produce islands of content where owners have changed, stewardship is unclear, and expiration never existed. At Copilot, and those islands become tributaries into every helpful answer. You didn't create a new leak, you created a new pump. So what prevents it? Hard edges, boundaries first, enforce default deny for data sources by risk class. If a source contains HR, legal, finance, or regulated data, it is opt-in by exception with expiry, not opt-out by oversight. Constrain graph scopes with allow lists per agent and per channel. In Teams, configure summarization boundaries to exclude private channels and sensitive domains. In Outlook, require label-aware summarization with redaction or refusal. If the retrieval step can't prove the source is in scope, the answer is no content, not best effort. Next, enforce sensitivity with effect, not aspiration. Labels must trigger behavior in Copilot interactions. Deny content with specific labels from grounding. Force redaction of detected sensitive types, and log any attempted inclusion in Activity Explorer. Use data security posture management to find where sensitive data is concentrated and where it's being referenced by Copilot interactions. If you see sensitive interactions rising in harmless apps, that's not an adoption victory, it's an exposure metric. Identity is your third lever. The caller's context determines blast radius. Separate agent identities from humans. Never let human makers' broad read writes flow into agent runs. Use intra-conditional access with authentication context, so high-risk users, elevated insiders, departing employees, operate under tighter Copilot constraints or are blocked from sensitive scopes entirely. Least privilege is not a governance slogan. It's how you shrink what the engine can see before it synthesizes. Then there's observability. Leakage is silent until you make it loud. Budget cost to telemetry, not to usage. Require prompt response audit trails, label-aware metrics, and anomaly alerts. Sudden jumps in sensitive label mentions, cross-domain co-occurrence you didn't expect, or Teams summaries citing SharePoint paths outside the project boundary. Treat cost spikes as smoke. Invisible agents, shadow prompts, and uncontrolled execution often show up as tokens first, incidents later. Common anti-patterns? Relying on prompt instructions like only summarize this channel and believing that's a boundary. It is not. Hoping sensitivity labels without corresponding DLP or purview enforcement will self-police. They do not. Enabling org-wide access for convenience and trusting that people won't place HR content there, they will. And publishing agent experiences without connector allow lists because we'll tighten it later. You won't. Entropy always wins unopposed. If this sounds heavy, it's because execution is heavy. But the controls are straightforward when you treat Copilot as a control plane, not a chatbot. Define the system, constrain the surfaces, enforce sensitivity with outcomes, separate identities, instrument aggressively. Then when someone asks for a summary, the engine compiles your boundaries, not your optimism, into behavior. Remember, Copilot did not overreach, your estate did. You are not misconfiguring Entra, you are under-designing your graph. Bound the context and the helpful answer stays inside the fence. Leave it open and the quiet leak becomes a record. Anchor failure 2, hallucinated authority, confidently wrong action. You've seen this one. A project lead asks, what's our approval path for vendor onboarding? Copilot replies, cleanly formatted, confident tone. Per section 4.2 of the procurement policy, finance signs off after security due diligence. Exceptions require VP approval. It cites nothing. Under time pressure, the lead forwards it and moves on. Hours later, security asks, what policy is section 4.2? It doesn't exist. The text sounded right, therefore people obeyed it. This is the most dangerous failure psychologically, not technically. The harm doesn't come from model inaccuracy. It comes from human obedience to confident prose under deadline. The system's voice carries implied authority. In organizations trained to trust official tone, credible phrasing is a controlled surface. Absent a gate, that surface becomes the policy. Root cause, no authoritative source gating, no refusal state, no citations that bind answers to canon. Without a source registry and a truth or silence rule, you've built an idea generator inside an execution environment. People will operationalize plausible fiction. They won't intend to. They'll be late, overloaded, and a sentence that sounds like a manual will win. Architecturally, this isn't an accuracy problem, it's a sourcing problem. You didn't define what counts as law for a given question, so the engine compiled patterns. Patterns are persuasive, they approximate the shape of internal policy language, the cadence of your writing. The probability distribution delivered a fluent paragraph. The control system accepted it as authority. Most teams try to fix this with prompt language. Only use official sources. That's not a gate, that's a wish. A gate is a registry, a catalog of SharePoint sites, Fabric lakehouses, and graph scopes that define canon by domain, procurement, HR, security. A gate is an evaluation step that rejects any answer without inline citations that resolve to that registry. A gate is a refusal model that says, I don't have an answer from the authorized corpus and stops. Inline citations are not decorative. They are the contract. No citation, no execution path. If the answer might drive a decision, require links into the source with stable IDs, version stamps, and label awareness. If the source is a policy, cite the policy record and the section anchor, not a file path that will rot. In practice, this nudges your knowledge stewardship as well. Wikis become versioned documents with anchors, emails become knowledge summaries in governed sites. Now consider the operational edge. Even with a registry, your corpus can be wrong or stale. That's fine, because the control pattern we'll use later separates reasoning from execution. You can route risky recommendations into the gate. Human or policy check happens there. The machine proposes. The human disposes. When the human declines, you feed the evaluator. Reason for refusal, source outdated, which retrains your quality metrics, not the model. There's a second trap here, assistants that propose actions with implicit authority. In Power Automate, a Copilot suggested flow might say, route non-compliant vendors to provisional approval, notify security post facto. It reads like a codified norm. Without a source-bound rule, that suggestion will be accepted by someone who assumes this is how we do it. That's how confidently wrong becomes irreversible change. The fix is the same. Bind suggestions to policy citations, enforce refusal when absent, and require planner gate before execute. What about we'll train people to ask for citations? You won't scale that. Humans forget. New hires don't know the canon. Contractors have no context. Design the refusal model so the agent stops itself. I cannot answer from approved sources. Make that message friendly but non-negotiable. Then give the user a frictionless recovery. Would you like me to search only the procurement policy library? Offer bounded pathways, not apologies. Detecting this failure before it becomes an incident requires telemetry. In your prompt/response audit, flag answers without citations, classify topics by domain, and alert when citation-less answers cluster around policy-heavy domains. Communication compliance can help. Jailbreak detectors can be tuned to policy evasion attempts, phrases like, as per our standard practice, without a binding reference. When you see them, it's not a user problem. It's a design absence. Common anti-patterns, letting Copilot search the open web for internal policy questions to augment answers, allowing helpful paraphrases of policies without a link to canonical text, accepting summaries that include company policy states without pointing to the precise source, and worst, approving actions, approvals, escalations, exceptions triggered by texts that sound official but are anchored to nothing. If this sounds heavy, it's because execution is heavy, but the controls are concrete. Build an authoritative source registry per domain. Require inline citations that resolve to those registries. Enforce a refusal when uncertain model. Silence beats fiction. Separate reasoning from execution so proposals can be reviewed. Instrument answers without citations and act on clusters. Teach the organization one phrase, truth or silence. Remember, Copilot didn't assert authority. You granted it by omission. In a distributed decision engine, anything that sounds like policy becomes policy unless you enforce what policy is. Encode that boundary, and confident text goes back to being a draft. Leave it open and pros will run your process. Anchor failure 3. Automation without consent. Irreversible change. Here's how quiet turns into permanent. A product manager asks Copilot to streamline the exception workflow. In Power Automate, the agent proposes a flow. When a vendor is missing a security document, create a provisional approval, notify the owner, and update the vendor record with a temporary flag. It reads like housekeeping. Someone hits create. 2 weeks later, finance discovers dozens of vendors with active spend and no completed due diligence. There was no meeting, no gate, planning and execution fused in one gesture. The draft became a right. Root cause. You let reasoning and execution share a rail. The same surface that brainstormed improvements generated a runnable flow connected to production with maker credentials standing in for a least privileged agent. There was no required plan, no human gate by risk tier, no sandboxed dry run, no rollback path. In other words, no design separation between here's what we could do and we did it. This isn't a tooling critique, it's a control failure. By default, Power Automate will happily let a maker with broad rights produce an always-on listener that mutates records. The model supplied plausible glue. The platform supplied capability. The missing piece was architecture, reason, plan, gate, execute. Without it, helpful suggestion becomes state change. Let's make the failure concrete. A flow watches a new vendor SharePoint list. Condition, if security doc is empty, set approval status equals provisional, send an email, and copy the row to an exceptions list. Hidden costs. Provisional is treated by downstream systems as approved for limited spend. Email alerts get filtered, and no one ever reconciles the exceptions list. The mutation looks reversible, flip the status later, but the side effects aren't. Purchase orders get issued, payments queued, audit trails stamped. Undo doesn't exist, compensating transactions do, and you didn't design them. What's the architectural correction? Separate the planes. Reason produces a documented plan with sources, assumptions, risks, and a shape you can evaluate. Plan becomes a machine-readable artifact. JSON, table, schema, not a wall of text. Gate evaluates by risk tier and data class. Low-risk proposals can auto-approve. Medium risk require human-in-the-loop approvals. High risk require human-on-the-loop plus policy checks. Execute runs least privileged actions with rollback and audit by default. That pattern turns idea into governed change. In practice, Power Automate gives you enforcement handles if you design for them. Mandatory approvals. Any flow that updates or deletes in Tier 1 systems routes through an approval action to a defined gatekeeper group. Simulated execution. Every proposed flow runs a dry run mode that logs intended changes without writing so you can review the blast radius. Connector governance. High-risk connectors and unknown APIs are blocked by policy in production environments. Only approved connectors are available in dev and test. Role separation. Agent identities separate from humans, with narrowly scoped permissions just for the intended actions. Rollback reality needs to be stated plainly. Without pre-planned compensating transactions, undo is a story you tell yourself. For every write capability you introduce, define the inverse. If a flow can set provisional, it must be paired with a closure path that either escalates to completed due diligence or rolls back and flags spend. Those are distinct flows owned by different roles with SLAs and metrics. Audit must see both directions, not just the happy path. Common anti-patterns? Letting Copilot wire flows directly in production because it's faster. Relying on maker credentials that have read-write across multiple systems for convenience, which widens every blast radius. Accepting free text approvals looks fine, with no machine-readable plan to compare against. Treating the test button as validation. It validates the button, not the outcome in live data. And believing a notification equals control. It doesn't. No one has time to read your email. Detection is telemetry, not luck. Instrument power, automate with anomaly alerts, spikes in update actions, new flows executing writes without recorded approvals, usage of connectors outside the allow list, or flows created by human identities but running as agents with broader scopes. Tie cost anomalies to execution, token or API spikes, often accompany unconstrained flows. When you see them, don't ask for better prompts. Ask which gate failed or which gate never existed. If this sounds heavy, it's because execution is heavy. That refrain applies here more than anywhere. Automation magnifies your design choices. Either you enforce separation and live in a deterministic world where proposals are reviewed and actions are scoped, or you let assistants drive your data and discover policies you didn't intend, encoded in flows you didn't review. One last point on psychology. The UI cadence suggests safety. It feels like building a spreadsheet rule. It's not. Each trigger plus action is a program that runs at scale on live data. The friendlier it feels, the more rigor you need. But that's not an argument against Copilot. It's a mandate to encode your control system so the engine compiles your guardrails, not your optimism. Automation without consent isn't dramatic when it happens. It's mundane. A checkbox here, a condition there, an email that no one reads. And then one day your ledger, your CRM, or your access model reflects weeks of temporary states that never reversed. That's irreversible change. Separate the planes or accept that every helpful suggestion is a right waiting to happen. Breathe. You've just heard why Copilot fails. Passive leakage, confident fiction, irreversible action. From here on, we enforce how it stops. The mandates that turn architecture into control. Anchor failure 4. Memory illusion, false trust. This one hides in plain sight. A manager asks Copilot, draft the follow-up we discussed yesterday. Same tone, same constraints. The reply looks familiar but nudges a detail, drops a qualifier, or reintroduces an exclusion you thought you killed. The user assumes continuity. Copilot didn't forget. It never promised to remember. You projected human continuity onto a stateless front paired to stateful caches. That projection creates false trust. Root cause. Uncontrolled prompt chaining and cached embeddings operating without an explicit state contract. In English, yesterday's context lived in the transient chat history and whatever embeddings the system cached from your documents. Today's request arrived in a new session, a different channel, or a different agent surface. The visible thread felt continuous. The underlying state was not. Without a designed boundary, start, scope, sources, reset, drift is inevitable. Architecturally, this matters because continuity is a safety claim. When users believe, remember when I said persists, they lower their guard, shorten prompts, and stop redeclaring constraints. That collapses determinism. The model backfills missing pieces from whatever is nearby, a stale vector index, a similar thread, or a default behavioral instruction. Outputs diverge. The divergence isn't dramatic, it's cumulative. Over days, small deltas become policy. The stateless front, stateful back pattern is the right foundation, but only if you expose it. Stateless by default means every session begins at 0 unless the user explicitly attaches state. Stateful back means you can persist context, documents, decisions, constraints under an ID with a time to live and provenance. The illusion is pretending stateless behaves like memory without the contract that ties requests to persisted context. That illusion breeds errors users won't catch. The mandate here is explicit state, session contracts, and a user-visible context ledger. A session contract defines what this conversation will use, sources, time window, labels, refusal rules, and for how long. The ledger shows, in plain text, this answer used, procurement policy, v3.4, label confidential, last week's project minutes, team A channel, assumptions, no vendor exceptions. Every answer updates the ledger, every new channel or day resets, unless the user explicitly reattaches the prior session. No phantom carryover, design clear reset semantics, changing channels resets, crossing midnight resets, moving from Teams to Outlook resets. Users can override by reattaching the contract. Continue session 7F3C until Friday. Force an explicit action, attach, extend, or end. If there's any ambiguity, default to refusal. I don't have your prior constraints attached. Would you like to reattach session 7F3C or restate them? Silence beats fiction. Cache governance matters more than most realize. Embeddings feel like harmless acceleration. They are memory without governance if you let them persist indefinitely. Set TTLs based on data class, hours for sensitive drafts, days for public docs. Purge cycles and audits must exist. Track who created the vector store, what source labels it contains, when it last refreshed, and which agents can read it. When users attach a contract, you bind to a versioned snapshot, not a constantly mutating index. Common anti-patterns, sticky sidebars that quietly carry instructions across tenants, channels, and days. Hidden system prompts that inject tone and behavior without user awareness. Auto-attached recent files that change as users browse, subtly shifting grounding. And the worst, long-running threads that migrate topics, sources, and stakes without a single visible boundary. Users trust the thread. The system silently drifted. Detection is behavioral. Look for answer variants on identical prompts across channels. For policy-heavy domains, variance is a smell. Instrument context-changed events, channel switches, model switches, index refreshes, and log whether a session was explicitly reattached. Alert on high-risk answers produced without an active contract. In audits, sample answers against ledgers. If the ledger can't explain an inclusion, you have phantom carryover. If this sounds heavy, it's because execution is heavy. But the controls are simple to teach. One phrase for users, attach or restate. One habit for builders, show the ledger. One policy for owners. Memory is opt-in, scoped, dated, and revocable. Remember, Copilot didn't forget you. You forgot to define memory. In a distributed decision engine, continuity isn't a vibe, it's a contract. Encoded and trust has a basis. Leave it implied, and drift will write your outcomes for you. Anchor failure 5, cost and chaos explosion. Here's how entropy invoices you. Adoption spikes. Leaders greenlight pilot everywhere. Within a week, token burn jumps, API calls triple, and someone asks finance why the Copilot line item looks like a seasonal surge. No breach, no scandal, just money evaporating into productivity. Cost looks like a finance problem. It is not. It's a security and governance problem wearing an easy metric. The pattern is consistent. Shadow prompts proliferate in Teams and Outlook. Helpful sidebars quietly hit graph and external endpoints. Maker-built agents run with human credentials. Flows trigger on noisy lists. Unknown connectors slip into dev that's actually prod. Nobody sees it because nobody instrumented it. Usage feels like success. Spend becomes the only visible telemetry, so cost becomes your first alarm bell. Root cause, zero observability, no routing discipline, unmanaged environments, and absent ceilings. You didn't classify agents by environment group. You didn't allocate budgets per team, per agent, per environment. You didn't block ambiguous connectors. You didn't capture prompt response logs or cost per answer. The system did exactly what you allowed. It scaled without boundaries. Tie cost to security debt. Spikes aren't random. They correlate with invisible agents and uncontrolled execution. A long-running thread with sticky instructions becomes a silent super user. A Copilot suggested flow polling every minute hits APIs 1,440 times a day per list, multiplied by departments. A summarizer grounded to a broad SharePoint scope slurps pages to answer a trivial question. You don't have a finance anomaly, you have an attack surface expansion you can finally graph. Start with observability as a mandate, not a dashboard wish. You need DSPM for AI to show where sensitive data intersects Copilot usage. You need Activity Explorer logging prompts and responses with label awareness. You need per agent, per environment cost curves and volume metrics. And you need anomaly alerts tied to policy. Sudden growth in sensitive label mentions, cross-tenant traffic, connector usage outside allow lists, or cost per answer doubling for the same task. Budgets are controls, not punishments. Allocate ceilings by environment group, dev, test, prod, then by team and by agent. When an agent hits 80% of its monthly budget, it notifies owners with usage decomposition, top prompts, top connectors, average grounding size, average answer length, and sensitive content references. At 100%, it pauses and routes to a review queue with a raise, redesign, or retire choice. Money becomes a circuit breaker that forces clarity. Routing discipline comes next. Default deny on connectors by risk class. Only approved connectors in managed environments. Block unknown APIs entirely in prod. For dev and test, allow with expiry and cost caps. Use environment groups to stamp these rules once for many environments. Anyone trying to wire a flow with a disallowed connector gets a refusal with a link to the approval path. Do not temporarily allow it. Entropy loves temporary. Design for cost-aware behavior. Force structured outputs so you aren't paying for walls of text. Require bounded context windows, sources by site, time window, and label. Cache governance with TTLs prevents stale, oversized vector stores. Teach agents short answers unless the plan requires depth. Measure cost per action for automations and reject proposals that exceed thresholds without justification. Think step by step is free. Fetch the internet isn't. Anti-patterns to kill. We'll monitor cost quarterly. You'll be too late. Prompts are just conversations. They're programs with bills. Let's open the web, then refine. That's how your spend becomes someone else's training data. We'll optimize later. Later is when finance locks the account. If this sounds heavy, it's because execution is heavy. But this is mostly plumbing. Instrument, budget, route, cap, alert. When cost surges, treat it like smoke from an electrical panel. Don't fan it with more pilots. Open the box and pull the wrong wires. Remember, the invoice is the only honest stakeholder you have in an unobserved system. It tells you where entropy won. Use it. Enforce ceilings. Make spend the forcing function that drags invisible agents into daylight. Cost isn't the problem. Cost is the light. Mandate 1. Define the system, not the feature. This is the first non-negotiable. Before you enable anything, define the system you're actually running. You are not turning on a feature. You are declaring a control plane with data, identity, tools, and execution semantics. If you don't name it explicitly, the engine will compile your ambiguity into behavior. Start with a system map you can read aloud. 1 page, 4 columns. Surfaces, data, identity, and execution. Surfaces, Teams, Outlook, Copilot in Word and Excel, Copilot Studio agents and Power Automate, data, SharePoint and OneDrive sites by risk class, Exchange mailboxes, Teams stores, Fabric, lakehouses, and external connectors you will allow. Identity, humans, agent personas, service principles, and authentication context for risk-based rules. Execution, which surfaces can only reason, which can plan, and which are permitted to execute under what gates, with what audit, and with what rollback. Name every surface. Teams is not a surface. Tenant-wide Teams summarization with channel exclusion controls plus private channel deny is. Outlook is not a surface. Message-level summarization with label-aware refusal and cross-mailbox deny is. Power Automate is not a surface. Dev test prod environments with connector allow lists, mandatory approvals, dry run, and JT elevation is. If you can't list it, you can't bound it. If you can't bound it, it will overreach. Next, define the intended outcomes and the unacceptable states. Outcomes are verbs with subjects. Summarize project channels excluding HR, legal domains. Draft but do not send vendor emails with citations. Propose, not publish. Flows to reduce polling. Unacceptable states are refusal criteria. Any answer without citations for policy claims. Any grounding that includes content labeled confidential, HR, legal. Any execution proposal without a machine-readable plan. Put the refusal states on the same page as the outcomes. Silence beats fiction. If you don't codify no-go zones, someone will operationalize a maybe. Translate intent into configuration objects. No narratives. Policies, allow lists, labels with enforcement, authentication contexts, environment groups, agent registries. For each agent experience, Teams Copilot, Outlook Copilot, a Copilot Studio agent, bind it to 1, an identity that is not a person, 2, a data scope that is default deny with named inclusions and expiries, and 3, an execution role that cannot exceed its tier. Reason-only identities can never call write connectors. Plan-tier identities can produce JSON plans, never invoke side effects. Execute tier identities act only through gate-approved workflows with least privilege and rollback. Model the decision graph explicitly. A request hits a surface which invokes retrieval through graph-scoped allow lists, which grounds into an evaluator that checks citations and refusal rules, which optionally emits a machine-readable plan, which routes to a gate, which, if approved, executes as an agent with constrained permissions and logs everything to audit. Draw the arrows. Put names on the boxes. Teams summarizer, retrieval filter, project sites A, B, time window, 14 days, labels, exclude HR legal, evaluator, citations required for policy terms, output, summary only. That is not documentation theater. That is executable intent. Define your source registry by domain. Procurement policy lives here. HR guidance lives there. Security standards live here. Each registry entry has an owner, a label, a version, and a stable anchor. Copilot doesn't search everything. It answers from registries or it refuses. Teach listeners one phrase across the org, truth or silence. Then wire the registry to your evaluators, so any claim that sounds like policy must carry an inline citation that resolves to canon or the answer stops. Establish environment groups as your scale lever. Personal dev environments, reason only, no external connectors, tight budgets, owner only sharing disabled. Team test, plan plus dry run, limited connectors, budget ceilings with alerts at 80% and stops at 100%. Production, gate-controlled execute, approved connectors only, cost per answer and cost per action metrics, activity explorer logging of prompts and responses with label awareness. Stamp policies once at the group, not 500 times per environment. Entropy hates inherited rigor. Instrument the system before you launch it. Budget is a control, not a report. Attach per agent ceilings, anomaly alerts for sensitive label mentions, cross-domain co-occurrence, connector deviations, and execution without recorded approvals. Define owners, human names for every agent identity and every environment. No owner, no runtime. Establish drift reviews, monthly checks on scopes, connectors, and refusal rates. If refusal is dropping to 0, your gates are eroding. If cost per answer is rising, your retrieval windows or sources are bloated. Common anti-patterns you will kill here. Will start open and tighten later. You won't. Labels first, policies later. Stickers don't stop retrieval. Prompts as policy. Wishes are not gates. Maker credentials as runtime. That's how blast radii become incidents. And the softest failure will keep a wiki of rules. Control planes don't read wikis. They read policies, scopes, and roles. If this sounds heavy, it's because execution is heavy. But this is the mandate that prevents you from narrating intent while the engine compiles entropy. Define the system once. Everything else is enforcement. Mandate 2, boundaries first, constraint context, then language. If mandate 1 names the system, mandate 2 draws the fence. You don't start with clever prompts, you start with hard edges that constrain what the engine can see and touch. Context before language. Boundaries before tone. Architecturally, that means 3 concrete controls: graph scoping, sensitivity enforcement, and connector allow lists. In combination, they convert everything the caller can read into only what this agent may retrieve. If this sounds heavy, it's because execution is heavy, but this is plumbing you set once, then inherit everywhere. Begin with graph scoping. Default deny at the agent level, then add explicit inclusions by site, team, mailbox, time window, and label. A team summarizer for Project A doesn't get all tenant SharePoint. It gets sites Project A, channels Project A General, time window 14 days, labels exclude HR's legal. In Outlook, summarization can see only the current mailbox, not shared mailboxes or shared folders, and it refuses cross-mailbox search full stop. If a scope isn't named, it doesn't exist. That is the difference between bounded retrieval and lateral discovery. Next, enforce sensitivity with effect, not aspiration. A label must change behavior at retrieval time. For high-risk labels, confidential HR, legal privilege, restricted finance, bind policies that either deny grounding entirely or redact recognized sensitive types before synthesis. Don't rely on model etiquette. Use purview policy to force deny or redact and instrument every attempted inclusion. So Activity Explorer shows sensitive interactions per AI app. That metric is your canary. Rising counts mean your fences have gaps. Connector allow lists are the third rail. Managed environments get a named set of connectors per risk tier. Dev can experiment with a small expansion pack under budget and with expiry. Prod gets only approved connectors, no unknown APIs, no generic HTTP in the dark. If a proposed agent or flow needs a new connector, it routes to the gate you defined later. Temporarily allow it is how entropy moves in. Don't sign that waiver. Language boundaries come after context boundaries. Prompt contracts do not replace fences. They live inside them. So once scopes and policies are tight, you define prompt constraints as device, not defense. In Teams, summarize this channel, exclude names, and output as bullets with citations. In Outlook, draft but never send. Reference only attached or in-thread content. The model cannot be polite enough to overcome a wide-open scope. But with a bounded corpus, prompt constraints make outputs machine-readable and auditable. Persona is a constraint device, not decoration. A procurement policy analyst persona narrows verbs and sources. Cite policy anchors, refuse without canon, never propose execution. A flow architect persona outputs JSON plans, never actions. Tie personas to identities and scopes so the engine cannot act out of character, even if the prompt tries to jailbreak tone. Make default deny the operational habit. High-risk sources start out of scope. Access is opt-in with explicit owner, purpose, expiry, and budget. Periodic reviews reprove scope and revoke by default if owners don't respond. This isn't bureaucracy, it's how you prevent one time for a demo from turning into always available to every summary. Add 2 critical refuse rules. First, no citation, no answer for any claim that sounds like policy. The evaluator checks the registry you defined and stops if the link isn't present. Second, no scope, no ground. If retrieval can't prove the source is authorized for this agent, the answer does not attempt best effort. The refusal message offers a bounded alternative, attach project to policy library. You give users a ladder back into the fence. For Teams in Outlook, bake boundaries into configuration, not culture. Team summarization excludes private channels and sensitive domains by policy, not reminder. Outlook summarization is label-aware and redacts by rule, not by etiquette. If a user needs a one-off, they attach a scoped contract with expiry. Your defaults remain safe. Common anti-patterns. Trusting only summarize this channel in a prompt to stop cross-site retrieval. Putting labels on content without deny/redact policies. Enabling Copilot on org-wide sites whose owners are former employee. And treating connector governance as a future hardening step. Future never arrives, entropy does. This mandate is simple to test. Ask, can this agent read X? If the answer isn't provably no unless your fence has a hole, constrain context first, then and only then refine language. Mandate 3, demand structured output or don't automate. If mandate 1 defines the system and mandate 2 draws the fence, this is the first mandate that enables automation under control. Without structure, you can draft. You cannot act. Wall of text is untestable, unauditable, and non-enforceable. Structure turns prose into a contract the rest of your control plane can evaluate. Here's the rule. If it's not machine readable, it's not actionable. That means tables, JSON, or schemas never freeform paragraphs whenever an answer might drive a decision, a ticket, or a write. Human readers can infer. Gates cannot. Evaluators need shape to check completeness, citations, and refusal reasons before anything leaves the reason plan lane. Start by separating outputs into 3 classes. Class A, narrative only, drafting emails, rephrasing updates, summarizing meetings. These never trigger actions. Let them be prose but still require citations when they assert policy. Class B, decisions that inform humans, recommendations, option matrices, risk assessments. These must be structured. Tables with defined columns, JSON with required keys, enumerations with explicit constraints. Class C, anything that could be executed, plans for flows, remediation steps, access changes. These must be structured and validatable against a schema that your gate understands. Tables are your friend for Class B. Define columns once per use case and reuse them relentlessly. For a risk recommendation, option, prerequisites, citations, predicted impact, residual risk, and refusal reason if incomplete. In teams, that renders readable. In your gate, those columns become fields to verify. Citations resolve to the registry. Prerequisites exist in the environment. Residual risk falls below a threshold. If a cell is missing, the evaluator refuses. Silence beats fiction. JSON is the right fit for Class C and plan artifacts. The pattern is simple. Goal, assumptions, sources, array of canonical links, steps, each with action, target, preconditions, rollback, risk tier, approvals required. Your evaluator enforces required keys, checks that each source resolves to the authorized corpus, confirms rollback exists for each step, and rejects any action that touches a disallowed connector. Because it's shape-checked, humans can approve quickly. Because it's bound to the registry, hallucinated authority can't sneak in. Now, build evaluators, real ones, not people reading and nodding. Code that enforces 3 things on every structured output: shape, citations, and refusal. Shape: does the output match the table or JSON schema? Citations: do the links resolve to the registered canon for this domain with stable anchors and acceptable labels? Refusal: if any required element is missing or an assertion lacks a valid citation, the output must carry a refusal reason field explaining why it stopped. You are not training politeness, you are compiling safety. This is where teams stumble. They treat structure as formatting. It isn't. It's governance. For example, a Power Automate plan that arrives as a bulleted list can't be diffed, can't be linted, can't be compared to what ran. The same plan as JSON can be checked against a policy that forbids loops, blocks unapproved connectors, and requires rollback. The difference is not pedantry, it's whether execute will ever be deterministic. Make structure ergonomic so people adopt it. Ship prompt scaffolds that produce the shape by default. When proposing a vendor onboarding exception process, output JSON with these keys. Embed those scaffolds in your agent persona so users don't have to memorize them. Provide one-click validators in Teams and Outlook. Validate plan runs shape and citation checks and shows exactly which fields failed. Reduce friction at the point of thought, not after the fact. Common anti-patterns: letting quick answers be free text because we'll paste into a ticket. You won't, and copy-paste loses context. Accepting tables that vary columns per answer. Evaluators can't enforce shifting shapes. Allowing execution proposals that cite internal practice without a link. That's just polite hallucination. And worst, retrofitting structure after the gate. If you didn't demand shape before review, you're rubber stamping narrative. Detection is easy if you instrument. Track refusal rates by evaluator. If refusal is near 0, your checks are theater. If refusal spikes on citations, your registry is missing canon for that domain. If validators flag missing rollback repeatedly, your makers are defaulting to writes. These are not content problems, they're control signals. If this sounds heavy, it's because execution is heavy. Embrace that. Structure is how you make proposals explorable, comparable, and safe to approve. It's also how you make them teachable. Your JSON and tables become living examples for the next agent run. Over time, your organization will internalize the shape, and Copilot will meet them there. Remember the chain. Mandate 1 defines the system. Mandate 2 constrains context. Mandate 3 supplies the first enforceable artifact. From here on, reason outputs structure, plan carries schema, gate enforces it, and execute refuses anything that arrives as prose. Without this mandate, you're back to walls of text and conditional chaos. With it, you finally have something a control plane can govern. Mandate 4. Separate reasoning from execution. Reason, plan, gate, execute. This is the reference control pattern. Memorize it. Reason, plan, gate, execute. It turns helpful into governed change and converts probabilistic suggestions into deterministic actions. If you implement nothing else, implement this. It's the spine that keeps the rest upright. Reason is where the model thinks, compares options, and gathers sources. It produces analysis, alternatives, and trade-offs. But reason never touches data or systems. It's read-only by contract. Its only deliverables are a structured recommendation and the citations that bind it to canon. If an output looks like prose that could drive a decision, reason refuses. Structure required. If an assertion lacks a registered source, reason refuses. Truth or silence. Plan transforms that structured recommendation into a machine-readable plan artifact. Not a wall of text, a schema. Goal, assumptions, sources with stable anchors, risk tier, and a step list where every step has action, target, preconditions, side effects, and rollback. The plan is a diffable object. You can lint it, compare it to policy, and validate it without touching production. Planning is not a euphemism for almost execute. It is the blueprint you'll put in front of a gate, Gate evaluates the plan against risk tier and data class. Low risk, low impact plans, read time only, no writes, no identity change, can auto-approve under policy checks. Medium risk plans, writes with rollback in a constrained data set, require human-in-the-loop approval by a named role. High-risk plans, identity, finance, HR, compliance services require human-on-the-loop plus policy checks, separation of duties, SOD conflicts, and counter-signatures. Gate is where silence beats fiction is enforced in code. If shape fails, citations don't resolve, or rollback is missing, Gate refuses. It doesn't negotiate. Execute runs the approved plan in the smallest blast radius with a separate agent identity that has only the permissions needed for those steps, only for the duration, and only in the approved environment. Every action is logged, every step checks preconditions, every write pairs with a compensating transaction you designed at plan time. If any check fails, execute stops and emits a structured failure report back to Gate. There is no best effort. There is no we'll fix it later. Now wire this into your platforms. In Teams, Reason outputs a structured recommendation table. Plan emits JSON. Gate is an approval card that renders plan shape, flags failed validations, and requires the correct approver role. Execute is an orchestrated backend process that runs only after Gate stamps the plan. In Outlook, Reason drafts but never sends. Plan produces a send-ready object with recipients, content hash, and citations. Gate routes to the sender's manager or a policy mailbox. Execute sends under an agent identity with DKIM, the SPF alignment, and logs the exact body. In Power Automate, codify the pattern. Reason is a Copilot suggestion that can only output a plan schema. Plan captures the proposed trigger, actions, connectors, and rollback. Gate is a required approval step that rejects any plan using disallowed connectors, missing rollback, or lacking citations for policy-dependent steps. Execute is the flow running in managed environments with an agent identity, not the maker's account, and with dry run mode available so you can inspect the blast radius before writes happen. A word on rollback. You either design compensating transactions up front or you accept irreversibility. For every proposed write, define the inverse and the conditions that make it valid. If a plan sets provisional, the paired rollback clears it, reverses downstream side effects, and creates an audit link between them. When Gate sees a write without a rollback step, it refuses. There is no we'll add it later. Telemetry is part of the pattern. Instrument refusal rates in Reason and Gate. When refusal drops to 0, the controls are theater. Track gate latency and approval sources. When approvals bunch around a single person, you have a bottleneck and a single point of failure. Measure cost per plan and cost per execution. When cost doubles for the same outcome, your retrieval bounds or execution environment drifted. Anti-patterns to kill. Brainstorming that directly emits runnable flows. Approvals that read like LGTM with no machine-readable plan underneath. Running execute under human credentials. And executing in production without a dry run option. If you see them, you don't need more prompting workshops. You need to enforce the pattern at the platform edges. If this sounds heavy, it's because execution is heavy. But discipline here buys you speed everywhere else. Reason moves fast, plan is reusable, Gate is predictable, execute is safe. You are no longer outsourcing architecture to a prompt. You are encoding it in a sequence the engine can't skip. Mandate 5, authority gating, truth or silence. We're going to remove the single largest psychological risk in this system, confident fiction treated as policy. Authority gating is how you force truth or silence at the point of answer, not later in training, not in a guideline. At runtime, start with an authoritative source registry by domain. Procurement policy here, HR guidance there, security standards somewhere else. Each entry has an owner, label, stable anchor, and version, not a folder path. A canonical ID you can cite, audit, and revoke. The registry is the law library. Everything outside it is noise. Bind agents to that registry through an evaluator that enforces one rule, no citation, no answer. If a claim sounds like policy, as per section 4.2, company standard requires, exceptions must. The answer carries inline citations that resolve to the registry entries. If the links fail, the answer stops. Not a softer phrasing, not a hedged guess. A refusal with a reason, no approved source. Silence beats fiction. This is not a prompt trick, it's a gate. Prompts can request, only gates can refuse, implemented as code in the same path that already checks shape. The evaluator validates 3 things: structure matches schema, citations resolve to canonical sources with acceptable labels, and refusal is present whenever either condition fails. You're not asking the model to behave, you're compelling the system to halt when authority isn't proven. Make refusal a first-class outcome. Friendly but immovable. I can't answer from approved sources. Would you like me to search the procurement policy library or notify its owner? Give the user bounded ladders back into canon, but never best effort. People under deadline will accept anything that looks official. Remove the option. Now, scope the registry to the work. In Teams, the project summarizer cites only project canon, minutes, design decisions, and posted policy summaries, never raw HR or legal. In Outlook, message summaries cite the current thread or attach policy extracts that live in the registry, not scraped text from a drive. For Copilot Studio agents, bind each persona to its domain. The policy analyst cites only policy with anchors. The controls engineer cites standards and procedure work instructions. Cross-domain requires an explicit attach with a session contract that names both registries and an expiry. Here's the enforcement detail most people skip: citation proof. The link must resolve to a registered artifact with a stable anchor, a version, and a permissible label. A pasted URL to a random doc is not a citation. A sentence that paraphrases canon without pointing to it is not a citation. The evaluator follows links, checks labels, no confidential HR legal in a public answer, and rejects if any element fails. You don't debate nuance, you stop. Guard against policy evasion. Communication compliance can flag jailbreak language, standard practice. As everyone knows, and we typically, per usual, when these appear in a policy-shaped answer without citations, route to refusal, and log an event, you're training the organization that policy is not vibes. It's anchors and owners. What about stale or wrong canon? Authority gating doesn't guarantee correctness. It guarantees traceability. When gate refuses a plan because the citation points to an outdated control, the human on the loop updates canon, not the prompt. That change propagates to every future answer because the registry is the single source. You fix the system, not the sentence. Make the gate ergonomic or people will rote around it. Provide insert citation actions in Teams and Outlook that search only the registry. Surface the most relevant anchors with preview snippets and labels. Offer file a gap when canon is missing, pre-filled with the refused answer and the needed domain. Owners get queued requests with context, not vague pings. Pause here. You've crossed the midpoint. Mandates 1.5 defined the system, drew the fence, demanded structure, split thinking from doing, and gated authority. Next, we make state explicit, see drift, and bind identity so enforcement survives contact with production. Detect drift with telemetry. Track the ratio of policy-shaped answers with valid citations to total policy-shaped answers. When it dips, your evaluators are off or builders are bypassing. Group refusals by domain. Spikes in no canon tell you where to invest. Log attempted external web citations for internal policy questions. Those are design defects, not user mistakes. Anti-patterns to kill, allowing for internal use only web results to pad answers, accepting summaries that claim company policy without anchors, letting builders mark whole SharePoint sites as canon without owner, label, and version, and worst, letting execution proceed on recommendations that read official but cite nothing. If this sounds heavy, it's because execution is heavy. But the contract is simple. Define the library, enforce the rule, teach the phrase, truth or silence. When authority is gated, prose stops being policy, and Copilot goes back to being a controlled contributor, not an uninvited lawmaker. Mandate 6, explicit state, session contracts, and context ledger. Continuity is not kindness. It is a safety claim. If you don't encode it, users will assume memory that doesn't exist, prompts will shorten, and drift will write your outcomes. Explicit state prevents that. Start by declaring sessions as first-class objects. Stateless by default. Nothing carries unless the user attaches a session contract. The contract names 4 things: scope, sources, rules, and time. Scope, which project, team, or mailbox this session covers. Sources, which registries, sites, or indices are attached, with versions and labels. Rules, refusal criteria, citation requirements, and output structure. Time, start, TTL, and expiry behavior. If any element is missing, the agent refuses and offers a bounded alternative. Attach Project Alpha policy registry and minutes for the last 14 days. No attach, no assumed memory. Expose a context ledger to the user every time the engine answers. Plain text, no magic. This answer used Project Alpha minutes 2025-06-04, public team, procurement policy v3.4, confidential policy. Assumptions, no vendor exceptions. Tone, external, refusal trigger, missing citation. The ledger is not decoration, it is the explainer that lets a human spot inappropriate carryover in 5 seconds. It also becomes the artifact your gate and audit rely on. If an inclusion cannot be explained by the ledger, it was phantom state. That's a defect, not a discussion. Define clear reset semantics. Channel changes reset, surface changes reset, midnight resets unless a user extends. Cross-tenant resets always. You can soften that by allowing explicit reattachment. Continue session 7F3C for 3 hours. But ambiguity defaults to refusal. I don't have your prior constraints attached. Users learn one habit: attach or restate. Treat embeddings like fuel, not memory. Cache governance gets the same rigor you give data. Vector stores have TTLs by data class. Hours for drafts, days for project minutes, longer for canon. Every store tracks provenance, who created it, from which labeled sources, when it refreshed, and which agents may read it. When a user attaches a session, bind to a snapshot, not a live index that mutates mid-conversation. Purge on schedule, audit what you purge. If this sounds heavy, it's because execution is heavy. Bind session contracts to identity and environment. A developer's reason-only persona in dev can attach broad project minutes but never HR. A Plantier agent in test can attach policy registries and plan templates, but never execution credentials. A summarizer in Teams can attach only the current channel and registered canon. Contracts include identity class and environment group, so your evaluators and gates can refuse politely when someone tries to carry a dev contract into prod. Make state visible at the right moments. Start of session, show the contract. Every answer, show the ledger. On reset events, emit a visible banner. Context reset due to channel change and pause. On attach, link the exact sources and versions. On expiry, refuse and offer reattach. Users stop guessing because the system narrates what it's using. Prevent silent drift with sticky instructions by scoping behavioral prompts to the contract. Tone, audience, and structure live in the contract. They don't bleed across tenants, channels, or days. System prompts that set organization-wide defaults are visible in the ledger as organization behavior with an ID and owner. No hidden autopilot. Detect failure with variance testing and telemetry. Run canary prompts across channels. Variance in policy domains is a smell. Log context changes and whether a valid contract was present. Alert on high-risk answers without contracts. Sample answers against ledgers. If an inclusion lacks a ledger entry, you have ghost state. Fix the pipeline, not the prompt. Anti-patterns you will kill. Long chat threads that meander topics and sources. Auto-attaching recent files as grounding, carrying instructions invisibly between products, and helpful summarizers that infer memory from phrasing like, as we said yesterday. Yesterday isn't a contract. Explicit state buys you determinism. Users attach or restate. Ledgers explain. Resets are predictable, embeddings are governed, and when something drifts, you have a date, a source, and a lever to pull. That's not ceremony, that's control. Mandate 7, observability, budgets, and drift. You can't control what you don't see. And in a distributed decision engine, invisibility is permission. Observability is not a report. It's the nervous system that turns cost into a signal, behavior into metrics, and drift into alarms. Budgets are not finance artifacts. They're circuit breakers that force explanations before entropy becomes policy. Drift isn't a feeling. It's a measurable departure from your declared shape, sources, and refusal model. Start with runtime visibility, not retrospective audits. Turn on DSPM for AI, so sensitive labels intersecting Copilot activity light up by app, by agent, and by domain. Use Activity Explorer to capture prompts, responses, grounding calls, and label context. That's not surveillance theater. It's the only way to answer 2 questions on demand. What did this agent read? And what did this answer rely on? If this sounds heavy, it's because execution is heavy. But without these traces, every incident becomes folklore. Make cost an owned metric, not a blame ritual. Track cost per answer for narrative tasks and cost per action for automations. Decompose spend by agent, connector, retrieval window, and answer length. When cost doubles for the same outcome, you don't have a budgeting issue. You have retrieval bloat, unbounded context, or a connector out of policy. Tie alerts to deltas, not absolute numbers. Cost per answer for Project Alpha Summarizer up 80% week over week. Average grounding size doubled. That's a design problem, not a team performance discussion. Budgets are control levers. Allocate ceilings per environment group, then per team, then per agent. At 80%, notify owners with usage anatomy and top offenders. These 3 prompts drove 60% of spend. Connector X added 40% latency and cost. At 100%, pause the agent and route a decision to gate, raise, redesign, or retire. No silent overages. Money is the only hard stop users respect under deadline. Make it an engineered stop with a recovery path. Define drift. Like an SRE defines error budgets, you declared shape, sources, refusal rates, and latency. Drift is deviation from that declaration. Instrument 4 drifts, shape drift, plan artifacts no longer match schema, new fields sneak in, required ones vanish. Source drift. Citations resolve to non-registry content, or registered labels degrade from policy to wiki. Refusal drift. Refusal rates collapse to near zero in policy-heavy domains. Your gates are eroding. Latency/cost drift. The same tasks take longer and cost more. Retrieval windows widened or caches bloated. When any drift exceeds thresholds, the agent enters degraded mode. Reason only, refuse execution, and demand a review. Alert design matters. Noise kills adoption. Silence kills control. Route alerts to owners with fix or refuse options, not FYIs. Bundle incidents by cause. 10 no citation refusals across procurement is 1 registry gap, not 10 tickets. Provide one-click diffs. Plan schema changed. Here's the diff. Here's the policy it violates. Give people ladders up the stack. Update registry. Tighten scope. Re-enable once thresholds are back in range. Observability must be persona aware. For reason-only agents, emphasize answer quality, citation coverage, and cost per answer. For plan tier, emphasize schema conformance, refusal discipline, and approval latency. For execute tier, emphasize precondition failures, rollback rates, and compensating transactions executed. Blend security and reliability. A spike in rollbacks without paired adjustments to plans is a signal. Execution is compensating for bad thinking upstream. Block the classic anti-patterns. Quarterly cost reviews. Too late. Dashboards nobody owns. Entropy feed. Will rely on user training. That's delegation, not design. Will trust labels alone. They're stickers without denier redact. And will optimize after launch. That's how drift becomes policy. This mandate implements pressure early, so small deviations become teachable moments, not audit findings. One more lever. Canaries. Run the same prompt weekly across channels for policy domains. Variance beyond a narrow band triggers investigation. Rehearse red flag tests monthly. If we turned this agent on for everyone tomorrow, what would scare us? Let the answers drive registry updates, scope tightening, or budget changes. Observability is not a one-time install. It's a practice. Remember the thesis. Copilot entropy grows by default. Determinism exists only by design. Observability turns guesses into graphs. Budgets force hard choices. Drift budgets keep your declarations honest. Implement them and cost becomes a light, not a fire. Ignore them and your first telemetry will be an invoice. Mandate 8, identity, least privilege, and agent personas. Identity is the blast radius. If you get this wrong, everything else is ornamental. Least privilege is not a slogan. It's how you turn smart suggestions into scoped actions that can't wander. Start by separating humans from agents. A person has broad context, shifting tasks, and legacy access you haven't cleaned up yet. An agent has a single job, a narrow scope, and a lifetime you can measure in weeks. If an agent runs with a human's token, you've already lost. So that's a shared identity disguised as convenience. Create dedicated agent identities in Entra for every Copilot Surface and Copilot Studio agent that can plan or execute. Each identity gets 3 bindings: role, scope, and time. Role is what the agent does: summarizer, analyst, planner, executor. Scope is the data and systems it may touch: named sites, channels, mailboxes, connectors. Time is the duration of privilege: start, end, and renewal policy. No binding, no runtime. Tie identities to authentication context. Risk-based controls apply to agents too. An execute tier agent that touches finance runs only from managed networks through managed devices with conditional access that denies if risk is elevated. Think of it as JAIT for machines. Elevation lasts minutes, not days. It's approved by a gate, not implied by a prompt. Personas are constraints encoded as identities, not costumes in a prompt. A procurement policy analyst persona can read the policy registry, summarize decisions, and refuse without canon. It cannot propose rights. A flow architect persona can emit JSON plans. It cannot invoke connectors. An executor persona can call a narrow set of actions in a single environment for a single workflow, only after gate approval and only with preconditions satisfied. If the persona can do everything, it's not a persona, it's a permission leak. Apply least privilege at 3 layers. Data. Default deny scopes with explicit inclusions and expiries. Actions. Minimal connector permissions per agent per environment with deny by default in prod. Identity, no role union. Don't let a single identity reason, plan, and execute. Separate them so telemetry tells you who thought, who proposed, and who acted. Enforce separation of duties. The human who approves a plan cannot be the owner of the executor identity that will run it. The team that maintains the registry cannot be the team that grants connector approvals. The person who built the flow cannot approve its elevation to prod. If this sounds heavy, it's because execution is heavy. But this is how you prevent friendly fraud and honest mistakes from becoming incidents. Introduce JAIT elevation for agents. By default, executor identities are inert. A gate-approved plan wakes them, grants the smallest necessary permissions for the shortest time, and logs every action. When the plan completes or time expires, permissions collapse to 0. Store no standing secrets. Use managed identities wherever the platform supports them. If you must store a secret, keep it in a tenant vault, scope to identity and plan, with rotation on every run. Watch for anti-patterns. Maker credentials used as service accounts. Kill that. Run as owner inflows. Kill that too. Long-lived app registrations with tenant-wide graph scopes. Replace with scoped app roles bound to environment groups. Broad power user groups that bleed into prod, split them and expire them. And the worst, copying an executor identity across multiple agents for simplicity. Simplicity is how an outage in one area becomes a Saturday for everyone. Telemetry closes the loop. Record which identity produced each answer, plan, and action. Alert on executor identities acting without gate references. Track permission changes per identity. Drift means someone's granting without policy. Measure the ratio of requested permission to used permission per run. High unused permission is a signal to trim. Rotate client secrets out of existence. Count them, then count down to 0. This mandate sounds like plumbing because it is. But identity is the only firm edge in a probabilistic system. Humans stay human. Agents become roles with scopes and clocks. Least privilege becomes measurable. And when something goes wrong, you don't argue about prompts. You revoke a key, tighten a scope, shorten a clock, and your blast radius shrinks on command. Mandate 9. Teams and Outlook controls, the conversational edge. Conversations are the most dangerous edge because they feel harmless. You ask, it answers. No apparent stakes, no visible scope. But Teams and Outlook are where leakage begins and policy becomes prose. If you don't engineer the edge engineers your incidents. Start with Teams summarization boundaries. Configure channel-level scopes as default deny, public channels in, private channels out by policy, not by etiquette. Exclude HR and legal domains outright unless a named session contract attaches those registries with expiry. Summaries cite only project canon and channel content within a defined time window, say 14 days, never tenant-wide context. If a user wants broader grounding, they attach it explicitly. No attach, no broadened retrieval. The model cannot be polite enough to cross a fence you didn't build. Apply persona constraints as identities, not vibes. The project summarizer for Teams reads only designated channels and registered canon. It outputs bullets, not essays, with inline citations that resolve to stable anchors. It never proposes execution, and it refuses when a claim sounds like policy without a source. Tie that persona to a reason-only identity with narrow graph scopes and a budget ceiling. That heaviness is where safety lives. This is how you convert conversation into governed retrieval instead of accidental discovery. Outlook requires label-aware refusal and redaction. Summarization can see only the current mailbox and current thread. Cross-mailbox search is a hard deny. When messages or attachments carry high-risk labels, confidential HR, legal privileged, Copilot refuses to synthesize, offers a bounded alternative, summarize headers only, or redacts recognizable sensitive types before synthesis by policy, not by prompt. Teach users that refusal is a feature, silence beats fiction, and redaction beats best effort with secrets. Disable silent send. Draft but never send is the law. A reason tier Outlook persona produces a structured draft with citations and a tone field. Plantier can generate a send-ready object with recipients, subject, content hash, and citations. Gate routes to the sender's approver or policy mailbox. Execute sends only under an agent identity with DKIM, SPF alignment, and full audit. Any attempt to bypass gate is a refusal with a link to the approval path. Temporarily allow is how mishaps ship. Kill sticky behavior across the edge. Behavioral defaults, tone, audience, structure, belong in the session contract and appear in the context ledger. They do not bleed across products, tenants, or days. If a user flips from Teams to Outlook, the system announces a reset and pauses. Context reset due to surface change, attach session 9C2A, hidden system prompts are logged as organization behavior with owner ID and version. No unseen autopilot, constrain attachments and recent files. Auto-attach recents looks helpful and behaves like uncontrolled state. Instead, require explicit attach of allowed sources with version and label. The ledger lists them. The evaluator refuses if the answer leans on a file not attached or a label not permitted. Your goal is boring predictability. Every inclusion is traceable, and nothing sneaks in because a sidebar was helpful. Instrument the edge like a production system. Capture prompt response pairs with label context in Activity Explorer. Alert on policy-shaped answers without citations, cross-mailbox access attempts, and sudden increases in sensitive label mentions within conversational outputs. Track cost per answer for Teams and Outlook separately. When it spikes, look for retrieval window bloat, overbroad scopes, or long answers where tables would suffice. Cost is a light here as well. Design refusals people accept, friendly, crisp, and prescriptive. I can't include legal privileged content. Attach an extract from the policy registry or restate without legal sources. Offer bounded ladders. Attach approved canon, adjust time window, or route a policy gap to the owner. Don't offer the web, don't offer best guess. You are training the org that conversation is still a controlled surface. Anti-patterns to remove. Org-wide teams, summarization with private channels enabled for convenience. Outlook summarization that reads shared mailboxes by default. Drafts that send on enter, and the quiet bleed where a tone instruction migrates from a chatbot to email drafts without a ledger entry. These aren't UX quirks, they're policy erosion. One more explicit line you need to hear. Most Copilot incidents will originate here, not because Teams and Outlook are malicious, but because they're constant, casual, and assumed safe. Engineer the edge, bound the scopes, label refuse in Outlook, persona restrict in Teams, show the ledger, And when something drifts, your telemetry will tell you before a forwarded summary does. Mandate 10. Power automate guardrails, where hallucinations become incidents. Flows don't hallucinate. People wire hallucinations into flows. That's why this surface is incident-dense. Once Copilot's good idea lands in a trigger and a write, you've converted fiction into state. Start with approvals as a law, not a habit. Any flow that can update, create, delete, or change permissions runs through a mandatory approval step tied to risk tier and data classes. The approver is a named role, not the maker. The approval card renders the plan JSON you already require. Goal, steps, preconditions, citations, rollback. No JSON, no button, block unknown, and ambiguous connectors. Production environments get allow lists only. HTTP generic, custom APIs without registration, tenant-wide graph scopes denied. Dev and test can request temporary access with expiry, budget, and a gate ticket. Entropy loves just this once. Don't feed it. Require simulated execution, dry run before any write. The engine evaluates preconditions, enumerates targets, estimates blast radius, and previews compensating transactions. If the diff looks wrong, the gate refuses with specifics, missing rollback, unlabeled sources, disallowed connector, or scope drift. Dry run outputs become the audit seat for execute. Rollback isn't a paragraph, it's a step per write with a predicate. If you can't describe the inverse and when it's safe, you're proposing an irrecoverable change. Gate stops it, period. Run as agent, not owner. Every flow executes under a dedicated identity with least privilege, JIT elevation, and a short clock. Standing secrets go to 0. Managed identities wherever possible. Tenant vault for anything else with rotation on run. Instrument like production. Log preconditions, approvals, identity, step outcomes, and compensating transactions. Alert on writes without gate IDs, connectors outside allow lists, high rollback rates, and permission changes clustered by identity. Say it plainly. Most Copilot incidents will originate here. Guard it like your change management system, because architecturally, it is one. The 10-point Copilot governance checklist. This is the artifact your security team will wish you had. It's short, it's enforceable, and it maps directly to the mandates you just heard. Use it before rollout, during design reviews, and in incident postmortems. Ask each question out loud. If the answer isn't provable in configuration or telemetry, it's a no. 1. Can this Copilot read X? X is not the tenant. X is the named default deny scope with explicit inclusions, time windows, and label behavior. Surfaces, sites, channels, mailboxes, list them. If you can't point to the graph scopes, environment group policies, and label enforced, deny, redact rules, you don't have a fence, you have a hope. 2. Can it execute Y? Y is the specific class of actions this agent may take, if any. Read only, plan only, or execute under gate with least privilege and rollback. Name the connectors, the environment, the agent identity, and the JIT elevation window. If run as owner shows up anywhere, the answer is no. 3. Who approves Z? Z is the gatekeeper by risk tier and data class, not a manager, a role. Procurement exceptions go here. HR rights go there. Finance changes require counter-signature. If the approval card doesn't render a machine-readable plan and show the approver's role, not just a name, you can't prove gate. 4. Where is the refusal state? Show me the rules that stop answers without registered citations, stop grounding without authorized scope, and stop execute without preconditions. Refusal is not a tone, it's a code path. If your evaluator can't emit refusal reason fields and your users don't see clear ladders back to canon, you're training compliance theater. 5. How is output structured? For anything that informs a decision or proposes action, show the schema. Tables with defined columns. JSON with required keys. Goal, assumptions, sources, steps, rollback, risk tier, approvals. If your gate can't validate shape, resolve citations to the registry, and diff plan changes, you're rubber stamping pros. 6. What's the state model? Stateless by default, with explicit session contracts when continuity is required. The contract name, scope, sources, rules, time. Every answer presents a visible context ledger. Resets on surface changes. TTLs on embeddings. If users can't see what was carried and why, drift is happening silently. 7. What's the budget? Per environment group, per team, per agent. Cost per answer for narrative, cost per action for automations. Alerts at 80% with anatomy, prompts, retrieval windows, connectors. Hard stops at 100% that route to gate, raise, redesign, or retire. If cost is a monthly report, not a circuit breaker, you're financing entropy. 8. Who owns telemetry? Owners, human names, for every agent identity, environment, and registry domain. Activity Explorer captures prompt response with label context. DSPM lights up sensitive interactions per app. Canaries run on policy domains. If nobody is accountable for drift budgets, refusal rates, and approval latency, your graphs are wallpaper. 9. What's the identity story? Separate humans from agents. Dedicated agent identities per role, with scope and time. No role union, reason, plan, and execute identities are distinct. Conditional access based on authentication context. Managed identities, no standing secrets, tenant vault if you must. If a maker token can run a flow, your blast radius is a person. 10. What breaks the glass? Incidents happen. Show the disabled switch per agent and environment group. Show the path to revoke scopes, rotate secrets, and force refusal to reason only across a portfolio. Show the audit linkage from plan to approve to execute. If your first move is an email, you don't have an incident path. You have a hope chest. Run the checklist before you turn anything on. Run it again when cost spikes. Run it after every refusal lol, because refusal drifting to zero means your gate's eroded. This isn't a maturity model. It's a go-no-go test. When the answers are provable in policy objects, scopes, registries, identities, and logs, you're running a control plane. When they're aspirational, you're narrating intent while the engine compiles behavior. One more practical note. Print this and give it to security, legal, data, and engineering with a single instruction. Answer in artifacts. If they show you a wiki, it's a no. If they show you a prompt, it's a no. Policies, allow lists, labels with effect, authentication context, environment groups, evaluator code, activity explorer traces, those are yes. Copilot entropy grows by default. Determinism has receipts. Reference control pattern, reason, plan, gate, execute. You've heard the mandates. Here is the operating system that binds them at runtime. Reason, plan, gate, execute. It isn't a slogan. It's the sequence that turns a probabilistic assistant into a deterministic change machine. Reason is the thinking surface. Read only by design. It gathers facts from bounded scopes, compares options, and outputs a structured recommendation with citations that resolve to your registry. No actions, no side effects. If the recommendation would inform a decision, it arrives in a table with your defined columns or a JSON object with required keys. If a claim sounds like policy without an approved anchor, reason refuses. Truth or silence. That refusal isn't UX etiquette, it's a code path enforced by the evaluator that already checks shape and citations. Plan is translation. It takes the structured recommendation and compiles it into a machine-readable plan artifact your gate can validate. Not prose, a schema. Goal, assumptions, sources with stable anchors and labels, risk tier, and steps. Each step includes action, target, preconditions, side effects, and rollback. If you can't name the inverse and the predicate that makes it safe, you're proposing an irreversible change. The plan gets a content hash, so humans and systems can talk about the same thing without guessing. Because it's a diffable object, you can lint it, compare it against policy, and store versions. Gate is evaluation plus authority. It applies your risk tiers and data classes. Low-risk read-only plans auto-approve under policy. Medium-risk writes require human in the loop by a named role, not a manager. High-risk domains require separation of duties and counter-signatures. The gate checks 3 things in code every time. Shape matches schema, citations resolve to approved canon, and rollback is present per write. If any fails, it refuses with a reason, and bounded ladders back to fix. Attach missing canon, add preconditions, supply rollback. Gate is where silence beats fiction, stops being rhetoric, and starts being enforcement. Execute is scoped, short-lived, and observable. It runs only after gate stamps the specific plan hash. It uses a dedicated executor identity with the smallest permissions for the shortest time in the approved environment under authentication context. Preconditions are checked before every action. Every write logs a compensating transaction design you declared in plan. If a precondition fails, execute stops. No best effort. If a step fails mid-run, execute triggers rollbacks and emits a structured failure report to gate with the plan ID, step, error, and what was undone. That report is not an apology. It's an artifact your telemetry and post-incident review can trust. Map this pattern to the surfaces. In Teams, reason outputs a recommendation table with alternatives and citations. Plan returns JSON. Gate renders an approval card that shows plan hash, failed validations, and required roles. Execute runs a backend process tied to the plan hash and executor identity with logs in Activity Explorer. In Outlook, reason drafts but never sends. Plan produces a send-ready object with recipients, content hash, and anchors. Gate routes approvals. Execute sends under agent identity with DKIM SPF alignment and full traceability. In Power Automate, Copilot suggestions can only produce plans. Approvals are mandatory for writes. Execute runs flows as agents with dry run available to preview blast radius. Telemetry closes the loop. Track refusal rates in reason and gate. Near zero means your gate's eroded. Track gate latency and approval sources. Concentration reveals bottlenecks and SOD risks. Track cost per plan and cost per execution. Spike signal retrieval bloat or environment drift. Tie every action back to plan hash and executor identity so you can break glass by plan, by agent, or by scope without guesswork. Common anti-patterns to kill with this pattern. Brainstorming that emits runnable flows, approvals over pros, run as owner credentials, no dry run for writes, rollbacks as narratives instead of steps. The fix is boring and repeatable. Reason structures, plan compiles, gate enforces, execute logs, and rolls back. If this sounds heavy, it's because execution is heavy. But once the sequence is real, speed returns in the only place it's safe, reason, while control anchors every action that follows. The red flag test you can run tomorrow. Here's the test that exposes risk without a committee or a 6-week review. Ask one question. If we turn this Copilot on for everyone tomorrow, what would scare us? Then run 6 passes fast with artifacts on the table, not opinions. Pass 1, data scope. Name exactly what this agent can read today. Not SharePoint, the named sites, channels, mailboxes, indices with default deny, inclusions, labels, and time windows. If anyone says it depends on the prompt, that's a red flag. Prompts don't draw fences. Policies do. If scopes aren't visible in configuration, stop and fix mandates 1 and 2. Pass 2, execution scope. Can this agent write? Where? Under what identity? With which connectors? For how long and with what rollback? Pull one real plan and trace it. Does it arrive as JSON with goal, assumptions, sources, steps, preconditions, rollback, and risk tier? If you see pros approvals or run as owner, that's a red flag. Fix mandates 3, 4, 8, and 10 before a button exists. Pass 3, refusal model. Ask for something policy-shaped. What's the exception process for vendor onboarding? Watch the answer. Does it cite your registry with stable anchors? Can you click through to a labeled versioned artifact? Or does it hedge with typically and standard practice? No citation, no answer is the rule. If the evaluator can't halt and emit a refusal reason, that's a red flag. Fix mandate 5. Pass 4, structure. Request a recommendation that would inform a decision. Choose between option A and B for renewal. Demand the table. Are the columns what you declared? Option, prerequisites, citations, predicted impact, residual risk, refusal reason if incomplete, or is it a paragraph? Then ask for a plan. Do you get the JSON you lint or bullets you can't validate? If shape shifts between runs, that's a red flag. Fix mandate 3. Pass 5, state, change channels, and ask a follow-up that relies on prior constraints. Does the system announce a reset and ask to attach a session contract, or does it carry phantom state and answer confidently? Does every answer show a context ledger, scope, sources, rules, time? If memory appears without a contract, that's a red flag. Fix mandate 6. Pass 6, telemetry and cost. Pull last week's activity explorer for this agent. Can you see prompt response pairs with label context? Can you calculate cost per answer and cost per action? Do you have budgets per environment group, team and agent, with alerts at 80% and hard stops at 100? Run a canary. Same prompt across channels. Variance beyond a tight band means drift. If you can't see it, or you see cost spikes with no explanation, that's a red flag. Fix mandate 7. End the test with identity. Show me the executor identity, its scope, and its clock. Show me separation of duties in approvals. If a human token can run a flow or a single identity can reason, plan, and execute, that's a red flag. Fix mandate 8. You'll finish this in an hour if the controls exist. You'll spend weeks if all you have are prompts and optimism. That's the point. The red flag test forces answers in artifacts, scopes, registries, schemas, evaluators, identities, logs. If they're not present, you don't need more training. You need to pause rollout and implement the mandates. Copilot entropy grows by default. This test tells you where it's already winning. From failures to controls. Closing the loop. Let's close the loop by mapping each anchor failure to the control that neutralizes it. Not advice, not culture, concrete enforcement you can ship. Graph overreach, the team summary that casually drags HR or legal, dies under bounded context. Mandate 1 defines the system as a control plane component, not a helpful pal. Mandate 2 carves the fence, default deny scopes, explicit inclusions, label-aware deny, and redact. In practice, that means channel-level scopes in teams, private channels and high-risk labels excluded by policy, not etiquette, registry-bound citations, so tenant-wide never sneaks in. If a summary crosses a label it can't carry, the evaluator refuses with a path back to canon. Leakage is prevented by design, not after-the-fact admonitions. Hallucinated authority, the invented policy asserted as fact, stops at authority gating. Mandate 5 installs a registry with owners, labels, versions, and stable anchors. The evaluator enforces no citation, no answer whenever a claim looks like policy. Answers that lack anchors refuse with a reason and bounded ladders. Search the policy domain, notify the owner, or restate without policy claims. You're not teaching better prompts. You're removing the option to look official without anchors. Automation. Without consent, the flow that modifies records without a human break can't form under separation and approvals. Mandate 4 splits reason, plan, gate, execute. Mandate 3 demands structure so gate can evaluate. Mandate 10 makes approvals a law, dry run mandatory, and rollbacks first class. Approvals render plan JSON with goal, steps, preconditions, citations, rollback, and risk tier. Disallowed connectors, missing rollback or pros instead of schema, are rejected in code. Execute runs under an agent identity with least privilege and a clock, not the maker's token. You turned good idea into governed change or you stopped it. There's no middle. Memory illusion. The false continuity that erodes trust goes away when state is explicit. Mandate 6 creates session contracts that name scope, sources, rules, and time, and context ledgers that list exactly what an answer used. Channel changes and midnight resets are visible, and pause the engine. Attach to carry, refuse when a user asks for continuity without a contract. Embeddings get TTLs by data class with provenance and snapshots bound to contracts. Ghost state has nowhere to hide because memory is either declared or it doesn't exist. Cost and chaos, token spikes, API bursts, and mystery agents become signal under observability and budgets. Mandate 7 instruments prompts, responses, grounding calls, labels, and cost by agent. You track cost per answer and cost per action, alert on deltas, and impose ceilings at the environment, team, and agent layers. Drift is defined and enforced. Shape drift, source drift, refusal drift, latency and cost drift push agents into degraded mode until someone fixes scopes, registry, or retrieval windows. Budgets become circuit breakers, not retrospectives. One more cross-cutting fix neutralizes blast radius everywhere. Identity. Mandate 8 separates humans and agents, applies least privilege at data, action, and identity layers, and enforces separation of duties. Reason identities read, plan identities compile, execute identities act for minutes, not days, with managed identities and no standing secrets. Approvers aren't builders. Registry owners aren't approvers. When something goes wrong, you revoke a key, shorten a clock, tighten a scope, and the incident ends where it started. Notice the pattern. Each failure wasn't a model problem. It was absence of boundaries, absence of anchors, absence of breaks, absence of state, absence of telemetry. The mandates fill those absences with enforcement. You define the system, constrain context, demand structure, split thinking from doing, gate authority, make state explicit, see and budget behavior, pin identity, engineer the conversational edge, and harden the action frontier. Now fold this back into your operating rhythm. Use the checklist before you ship, during design, and after incidents. Teach the reason, plan, gate. Execute sequence until you can say it in your sleep. Run the red flag test monthly. Let the results update registries, scopes, budgets, and identities. If refusal rates fall to 0 in policy domains, you tighten the gate. If cost doubles for the same outcomes, you redesign retrieval. If a plan lands as prose, you don't lecture, you block the approval button. Copilot entropy grows by default. Determinism exists only by design. You don't need a culture change to start. You need to enforce your intent with code paths the engine can't skip. When you do, the firefighting stops, and the control plane you thought you bought is finally the one you're running. Pause before the boardroom. You've heard the failures, the mandates, the checklist, the pattern, and the red flag test. Now we translate this into what your board owns: boundaries, refusal, identity, and observability, with on-off switches and names. Executive brief to your board: what you own. Let's make this unambiguous. You don't own prompts, you own the control plane. That means 4 things with names, artifacts, and on-off switches. First, you own the boundaries, not the features. Define what any Copilot can read and where it can never look. That's default deny scopes by surface, explicit inclusions with expiries, and label-aware deny and redact. And if a director asks, can this agent see HR or legal? Your answer is not a slide. It's a policy object that says no, with an audit showing it refused last week. When leakage happens, it's never the model. It's a missing fence. Second, you own the refusal model, not optimism. Truth or silence is not a slogan. It's an evaluator in the answer path. No citation, no answer, no schema, no plan, no preconditions, no execution. Refusal rates in policy domains should not trend to 0. When they do, your gate's eroded. You don't ask for better behavior. You instruct your team to restore the code path that refuses without canon and routes users back to owners. Third, you own identity separation, not convenience. Humans and agents are different species. Agents get dedicated identities with a role, a scope, and a clock. Reason reads, plan compiles, execute acts briefly under gate. No shared tokens, no run as owner, no standing secrets. Separation of duties is not a compliance paragraph. It's who can approve, who can build, who can execute, never the same names. When something goes wrong, you should be able to revoke a key, shorten a clock, tighten a scope, and watch the blast radius shrink in real time. Fourth, you own observability, budgets, and drift. Cost per answer and cost per action are not finance metrics, they're health signals. Drift is defined and enforced. Shape, source, refusal, latency. Budgets are circuit breakers at the environment, team, and agent layers. At 80%, an owner gets the anatomy and a decision. At 100, the agent pauses and gate decides, raise, redesign, or retire. If your first telemetry is an invoice, you're funding entropy. Why now? Because the estate is already accumulating invisible agents, runtimes, and side channels faster than policy can catch up. Every week you delay, temporary scopes become de facto norms, helpful defaults become policy, and prose approvals become change management. The firefighting you see, silent leakage, confident fiction, irreversible automations, false continuity, cost spikes are not AI surprises. They're architectural omissions with your name on the control register. What do you ask for? 3 artifacts in writing with owners. 1. A live registry of canon with labels, versions, and anchors. 2. The evaluators that enforce structure, citations, refusal, and plan gating, code, not guidelines. 3. The inventory of agent identities with roles, scopes, clocks, and the incident path that disables by portfolio, not person. And then impose the operating system. Reason, plan, gate, execute. Ask your teams to answer every question in artifacts, scopes, registries, identities, logs. If they show you a wiki, it's a no. If they show you a prompt, it's a no. Control the control plane, or it will control you. If you remember one thing, remember this. Copilot entropy grows by default. Determinism only exists by design. Put the boundaries in code, gate authority to truth or silence, split thinking from doing, and make state and identity explicit. Use the checklist before rollout, enforce reason, plan, gate, execute, and run the red flag test tomorrow. If any control fails, pause, fix the plane you fly. Then, and only then, turn Copilot back on.